there was some people before the 1800s that were born with intellectual disabilities were left in the woods, or the Aboriginal people used to leave them behind. This has been, and there was a couple of identifications of a number of people by, in fact, medical students in the 1800s, identifying that we could train these people. You didn't have to actually throw them out of society. And one of these was the wild boy of Avignon, where it was demonstrated by Itard that he could train this boy to actually learn something. This was a revelation. And that moved from people with intellectual disabilities being seen as little holy innocents and being significantly marginalised to be seen as trainable. What happened then, I think in 1859, if I've got it correct, that gentleman who's got, I've got Guess Who under his name, I hope you can all guess who he is, a gentleman called Charlie Darwin, came out with On the Origin of the Species. And he started to think about species, obviously, in a stratified way. This work led to other people thinking about the quality of the species and the human species and the development of eugenics, the science of trying to improve the quality of the human condition or the human being. If you've got an intellectual disability, you're not going to turn out well in this type of scenario, are you? And in fact, Henry Goddard up there, who was at Vinelands in the US, did some actually bodgy research, and he's actually touched up some of these photos. These are some of the people that he called feeble-minded. And he's touched up these photos to demonstrate and made a link between intellectual disability and criminality and low morality. He published this in the early 1900s, and there was active discrimination against this population, including considerations of sterilisation, etc., etc. Unfortunately, this, if you read Stephen Jay's book, The Mismeasure of Man, he debunks all this work. I mean, there was some extraordinary stuff done, and it was considered mainstream and quite important at the time. This was not, wacky out there science. Unfortunately, the Nazis republished Goddard's book and then exterminated 250,000 people with intellectual disabilities during their reign, calling them the useless eaters. What an idea can do, eh? Since then, there's been the international human rights charters and human rights for people with disabilities as well as the general population, and a movement in your lifetime, depending on how long that's been, towards a generic system, and a recognise that we need to move away from institutions, from labelling people, and we need to move to a system of inclusion and participation and involving people with intellectual disabilities community. Now, why I tell you this story is because I believe fundamentally in your every move we are hardwired by this history. We are hardwired by this view of people with intellectual disabilities, which is incredibly negative. The scale, for example, one of the technologies, this is actually a woman I saw a few years ago who came to me with a mild intellectual disability and the first presentation of epilepsy. We did a CT scan, which in my lifetime is new technology. I know it's now old. And we found this black spot. That's the brain. That's the skull, which is thick, but there's a black spot, which means air, in the side of her brain. You can all see that. What the clever people, the radiologists could tell me is, in fact, what this was indicating is this woman had a bleed in the uterus in her brain, and that explained both her intellectual disability, explained her epilepsy, and it said to her brothers and sisters, your risk of having a child like this, like your sister, is no different from anybody else. A profoundly important message for the family and for her to some degree, and certainly explains things. Finally, the gene technology. I found this quote from Watson, who talked about the Fragile X gene. The most common inherited form of intellectual disability is a condition called Fragile X. Now, in Fragile X syndrome, you can see there's a fragile site here. You see it's where it's nipped off. This causes a moderate intellectual disability, particularly in males. Now, I have got background. Then you don't have another bit there to compensate. So you get the full-blown condition, which they tend to have long faces and large ears, and although are indistinguishable in children. Now, what's happened because of this identification, in fact Australia's been at the cutting edge of this identification, is we've suddenly been able to test strategies and drugs, and we know that some drugs, for example, increase attention and concentration in this population, so that we can actually target this. They now know the biochemistry. They know that this changes the methylation of one gene, and this is one gene that leads to change in protein. And we can fiddle with all this stuff in R. And this is all coming upon us now, and it's coming rapidly. And hopefully will provide great things for people with intellectual disability. But what did we do? Since the development of those centres, in 1997 I moved to Queensland after doing those surveys, and I looked at what you could possibly do for this population as a GP. And we've done some things that are focused on education. This is a therapeutic guidelines book up here. This is the first whole-of-life handbook on health and intellectual disability in the world. That's how neglected this area is. And it's now used for the main specialist training scheme in the Netherlands as their textbook. It's been translated into a number of languages. We're currently doing the 3rd edition. Available virtually to all GPs on their desktop, so that even if you're in data, you can go and it'll come up and tell you what drugs to use or how you should approach this patient. So that was one thing we did. We've developed websites. One of them was for people with intellectual disabilities and diabetes, called Diabetes to the Point. In fact, this is the comprehensive health assessment thing that we developed with the Endeavour Foundation and other groups. It basically tries to address some of those fundamental needs. It's just a booklet. It gathers the health story so that GPs can flick through and ask supplementary questions. And it also means that people have to gather a health story, because believe it or not, people who support these people don't necessarily know their health story. You know, I've seen people, I saw one guy, Ray, who came in to see me, and they said to me, we want to know if Ray's grumpy old man or he's depressed. And I thought to myself, I'd be a grumpy old man being cared by you lot. And when I examined Ray, he didn't have any testicles, and I asked him very politely where they were, and he didn't know. So I asked the staff where they were, and they didn't know. And the reality is, if he doesn't have testicles in the right place, his risk of getting cancer is 300 to 400-fold. So it was a really important point, and eventually we found them. But you know, people lose information. This staff lost a whole lot of information. We then tell GPs what to do, our practice nurses what to do. We guide them through what they need to look at. We try to increase the communication between them and people with intellectual disabilities and their families. And we provide the health staff with some information, because quintessentially they need support. So we got them, and we randomised into some people getting this and some people not getting it, and we followed the outcomes by actually going through the GP's notes. And what we found is a many-fold increase in all healthcare activities. I mean, it's intuitively obvious. The difference that we did is we did it as a randomised controlled trial, and we're able to absolutely say this. Other people have started doing this stuff through the years, but not actually done it as rigorously as we have. What was the consequence of this? So we got a shift in terms of delivery of healthcare, those things that I talked about. At the same time, we'd been lobbying the federal government and the state governments to implement this. And indeed, we'd set up some health targets internationally about 10 years prior to it, which we got an international organisation to endorse, fully intending to use this to thrash across the face of governments. And eventually what happened after, when there was one particular seminal point, when a group that I work with met with Tony Abbott when he was health minister in his office in Manly, and he came out in bare feet and said, "Well, come in. If you can help me fix the health system, then I'll do it." And we're not here for that, Tony. Oh, okay. And he got that just by doing this simple process, you could actually push along the healthcare of this population. This, according to Eric Emerson and other international people, is the only evidence of anything that improves the health of this population in the world. Tony got this. We faxed him my article that we published, and he rang up Joan Holton, the head of DOHA, because she told me this, and they instituted the development of a Medicare assessment item to actually fund people to do health assessments in people with intellectual disability, announced, I think, in 2006. It's now been implemented across Australia. The tool is licensed in most states, and also used in the UK, New Zealand, and they're about to trial it in Canada. So it's been a wonderful thing to come from a position of actually being a GP, lost in space, to actually doing research and actually seeing it implemented. And a rare and lucky circumstance, in fact, that that's happened. So that's what we did. Why is it love in the time of randomised controlled trials, you might ask? The reason is, when I was talking to my GP colleagues about doing this, they said, they won't do it, Nick. They will not do it. It takes too long. I said, oh, yeah, give it a go. And when we rang up, most randomised controlled trials, 10% of the people that you ask to be part of it, because they don't know whether they're going to get the good stuff or not, say yes. 70% of the clients of Endeavour Foundation said yes, and their families. 92% of their GPs said yes. This was going to cost them time and money in an already busy practice. What's that about? That is about relationship. And we've got to make sure we use that relationship at every time. And that's why I think it was an example of love in the time of randomised controlled trials. And what of the future? I mean, I think the future, I think it's a very exciting area. In some ways, the reason that we've had success is because the situation was so bad, actually. But there's a whole lot of technologies out there, and we're looking at, we have a cooperative research centre being worked up and hopefully funded on autism, and using IT technology in autism, for example, with the university. There's a program currently called the Student Health Advocacy Project that's running through UQ, and we hope to globalise, where students are being introduced to people with disabilities. They're going along for the health assessment, the CHAP item, and advocating and being part of that process. And the insights that the students are having are wonderful. So we're trying to change things at that level in various ways, and we're doing that project with the Endeavour Foundation. We're also trying to genericise our research into generic research, because the truth is, yes, I can do these clever little things on the side, but we need to be embedded in mainstream research. When you hear mental health data, you will hear the National Mental Health Studies reported to you about the prevalence of depression, psychosis, whatever. Guess what? They exclude people with intellectual disabilities. The longitudinal study of women in Australia, which UQ is part of, largely exclude people with intellectual disabilities. Why? Because it's hard to get a story out of them. Very simple. We really need to actually make mainstream research not exclude this population, to go the extra miles to do this. And we're doing this with the current Ipswich study, which is a large community-wide study run by Robert Bush and co out in Ipswich. We're looking at technology in various ways. I think the other thing that we need to do is we need sustainability. Although I'm the only professor of this area really in Australia that's not an emeritus professor, and that's pretty bad. And it's also enormously sad. The centres that I'm the head of, probably the most successful centre in Australia, but they have substantially unstable funding, and I suspect are unlikely in the long term to exist. And I think that we do need to sustain people that are going to innovate on the side, that are going to look for innovations. For me personally, I think there's a whole lot of areas like the CHAP where we can do innovations for disadvantaged groups. I would love to do this work in people with chronic mental health problems, because there's a huge unmet need there, or people with brain injury, or homeless. Now, Grant stole my thunder. I actually tried to memorise this last night, because it's the opening line of the Productivity Commission report. The current disability support system, underfunded, unfair, fragmented and inefficient. It is the best opening that I've ever read out of any report, because it actually goes straight to the point and it doesn't muck around. And I totally agree with this and very supportive of what they see. Okay, so in conclusion, there's much that needs to be done and I think the point is can be addressed. There's a whole lot of avenues that need to be thought. I think, hopefully I've demonstrated you, sometimes it's also useful to have practitioners involved in this, because there's a tendency in the disability field to marginalise health practitioners, and their voice needs to be in it because they're doing this stuff. And I've demonstrated, I think, that we can make a significant difference. And it majorly concerns me, David, that an NDIS, in fact, has no practitioners that actively practice any of their boards. And I think that's an omission that needs to be addressed. And yes, I guess I can only say that I think we need to fully fund the NDIS, and I encourage you all to do that. Thank you for listening.